Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. Today we're going to be speaking about
political news, pitfalls, and keeping your head. And we're in the middle of election season, but it seems like here in America, we're always in the middle of election season, at least, in the lifetime that we live now. And we're a little bit different if you compare the way that we do things here to other countries. So it might seem normal to us to have constant talk about politics and who's doing what and who's for what and who's against what. In most other developed countries, there's like a given time period where you can run for election. Whereas here, whoever it is, they start campaigning years ahead of time for president. And it's like that. If you're a representative, you're basically full-time campaigning your entire time because you only get 2 years. Even senators are constantly doing that as well. And so, that's going to kind of get to us. And actually, I should ask you, Dan, do you ever get kind of dismayed? Now, I won't say deranged, but, does the political news that we're constantly bombarded with on, television, radio, social media, pick whatever else you like, does that ever get to you?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a little bit of a news junkie, and then when things get heated up, I have to do certain things. So we'll kind of talk about some of the things that we are talking about are some of the tools that I've used in the past to try to curtail that, because it can really hit you in a place that makes you seek it out constantly. It hits kind of a dopamine center for you, and how does one rationally think about that, and then come to some plans that help you look at this whole thing from a more rational point of view, but is definitely preferable. But I agree with you. I think when I say the French elections have you got a month to a campaign, and the last week you aren't able to run any
advertisements,
ads or even campaign. So everyone's run, and then stop, and everyone has a moment to think, and then they actually vote. And I was like, that seems like a much more rational way to go about this, instead of these, 6 months to 4 year long campaigns that are just constantly going.
Yeah, I wish we had something like that, but what are the odds of us ever getting it? It would take the politicians to vote it in. And even if we weren't as polarized as we are, where if one side is for it, the other side has to be against, there's no way they would ever get together to restrict themselves in that way. And in part because, if you start a political campaign, you get this giant fund that you can draw upon for everything from steaks to travel to blazers to putting yourself up in a hotel to road signs, So it would be against their interests for the political class to do that. And actually, I've got a question for you, because we have an age difference between us. It's not huge, but so I remember a time when, political campaigns would take place, and they could get kind of nasty, but you could only get the news basically on TV at 3 times in the day. Radio, you could hear a bit more, top of the hour, they would, talk about whatever the thing was. And there was news radio that you could listen to. And then you had a newspaper that came once a day, maybe twice if you were in a huge city. There could be a morning and evening edition, but I don't think that was the case at all ever for the Waukesha Freeman or the Milwaukee Sentinel or Milwaukee Journal. And then, it changed. And I remember one of the key ways it changed was during the Gulf War, when CNN was doing live 24-hour coverage of it, and we were all sitting glued to the TV. So, do you remember, are you old enough to remember a time when things were, let's say, less 24/7?
Constant?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I guess quickly, the Journal was the morning, and I think the Sentinel was the evening paper, or vice versa.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So,
and they had different political leanings. The Journal was Democrat, the Sentinel was Republican. Waukesha Freeman was Republican, more or less. So, we actually got the Journal and the Freeman, so we would get a nice mix of news,
Right. I remember, I think one of the Clinton campaigns, I think, is the first one that has very salient to my memory.
Okay.
And then the Gore campaign was the first one that I was, kind of aware of as a generality, but, that was still really in the very, beginnings of, whole CNN. I think that's the first, constant news network. Yeah. I do remember we would
funny
listen.
You made it stand for that, right? Constant news network.
Yes. But I do remember, we would often listen to, NPR, but once again, similar. There is the news in the morning, news in the afternoon, and then there's other programming, just with, also the nightly news. I remember actually watching the nightly news back then with the family every once in a while.
Yeah, back then we had breaking news that actually was breaking news, and it was breaking not just because people were breaking a story, but it would break into your regular programming. It was usually something bad, right? There wouldn't be, if it was something good, they could wait until 10 o'clock. But if it was something bad, like somebody, Reagan getting shot or something like that, they'd cut right into the major news stuff. So that's kind of interesting. So where are we today, right? We're in this constant news cycle. I think, people who are younger have never not lived during that, and it's much less driven in the present by actual journalism. It used to be that, there were partisan stances, but now it's much more aimed at driving ratings and often being part of the story and stirring up controversy. And, things have changed in terms of partisanship. And, political scientists demonstrate this, showing graphs where, the two parties are much further apart than they were. I think we talked on this show a while back about people refusing to date or even consider dating other people who belong to the opposite party as a sign of partisanship. And, we can say that there's been a really hard rightward swing by the Republican Party, first with the Tea Party, then with MAGA. And so, there's a lot of discord. It seems like we're always in the middle of some crisis. There's always some news story that's breaking. And I'm kind of curious. You described yourself as being a news junkie. So there's a danger to that, right? When you're in an environment like this, they're looking for you. They want to push whatever buttons they can with you and get you to listen to the newest story. So, do you still consider yourself a news junkie, or?
It wanes and waxes, but at the moment it's waxing.
Okay.
And I get to the point where I'm becoming aware of it and need to press that wane button again. And so this is quite the appropriate topic for me as well at the moment.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we are near an election, right? And it's an important election. But what we're going to look at here really applies to any time. Because, whoever wins the election, a good portion of America is going to be ticked off and telling terrible stories about them and, raising trouble. And it's just going to continue and continue and continue. I don't think this is ever going to get better in our lifetime. But there's some good news. It's not like this is radically new. We've had partisanship and bad political news throughout all of human history. Some of the earliest documents that we have, if they're not just trade documents, like some guy complaining about being cheated out of good copper in Mesopotamia, it's like complaining about your political opponents, or the king is an idiot, or stuff like that. And philosophers throughout history have talked about this as something that we can deal with. So there's resources that we can draw upon. But before we tell you about all them, we should talk about what's wrong with this. I mean, some people who I've also heard the term political junkie, and these days if somebody calls himself a political junkie, I usually distrust them. I'm like, oh, that guy's going to be trouble, They, I think, would not see this as problems, but I think a lot of people are really suffering in the present because of all of the conflict and bad news and things. So we should kind of talk about how people are affected. You want to start with talking about emotions, or?
Well, I just wanted to add, whenever the United States doesn't have an overarching, external enemy, we kind of come back and we try to create them herein. And it's this kind of waxing and waning. If we, while the USSR was still a thing, there was a little bit more harmony. There wasn't so much infighting. There's definitely things like the Red Scare and whatnot, but there's that was all associated with this external group.
Yeah.
And it seems that humans, in part, tend to find conflict whenever there isn't. If it is too harmonious, there's a tendency towards trying to find something, and you can see this in, smaller instances of politics. You think of a homeowners association or something. That's if you're not doing something, then what are you doing? How do you show that you're fighting the good fight?
Yeah, I think back to when 9/11 happened and we went into Afghanistan, and then we started Gulf War II by going into Iraq. And I think there were, there was one vote in, I forget whether it was the Senate or Congress, to not do that. There was so much unanimity about these things. I mean, it was less with going into Iraq. It was a harder case to make there. But it was quite interesting to see, because I hadn't seen that sort of level of consensus on anything for a long, long time. Yeah. Didn't last though.
Yeah. But it seems that all these things are at least partially emotionally charged.
Yeah, and there's a whole gamut of emotions that people could feel based on, what would we call it, consuming too much political news or taking all of it too seriously. So what do you think are the most troublesome emotions that people end up feeling?
Oh, I think we often talk about it, and it's anger.
Oh, right.
This, and how does one get to the point of anger? You build up an other or an enemy, and once you create, especially within a populace, an enemy within it, then you are now attacking your own fellow citizens, and I think that's probably one of the worst things that happens from this type of political discord.
Yeah, it primes people to take offense at stuff that isn't really intended to be offending or offensive. And it becomes part of one's character. If you're constantly taking offense because you're consuming a diet of information that's coming from one side, and you hear about how terrible these other people are, well, you see them doing something. They could be petting a puppy, and you'll be like, those bastards, can you imagine them trying to get on our good side by pretending to like puppies? People are pretty irrational that way.
It is Star Wars, but sometimes it's kind of poignant. The whole fear leads to anger.
Oh, right.
If you are constantly feeding people fear, then it's very easy for you to how do you solve this fear? Oh, you can be angry at them and then try to harm them before they harm you. And that's
anger is a feeling that gives us a false sense of being in control of things, having agency. And when we're made to feel afraid, we're losing that, we're lacking that. And so there's a lot of people, their fear response translates right away into anger because they'd much rather be angry than afraid. And there's a lot of fear mongering. It could be fear about the community itself. We're going to lose the nation. The country is under attack from within, or it could be fear for yourself. Oh, I'm going to lose my job, or I'm going to have to, I got in on this student loan program, and if, these people get their way, I'm going to have to pay all that money back, or pick whatever else you want.
Or they're destroying your way of life.
Right. Yeah. Or, so it could be not just about you. It could be about your family. It could be about people you care about. Yeah. So there is a lot of fear mongering. And I kind of think that the more you push these buttons, the easier it gets to push them with people. They're learned responses.
Mm-hmm. And it's like, if you see a lot of the political discourse, like, regardless if you're like either on MSNBC or Fox, they use fear of the other, the out group, to constantly push this. I feel, some organizations are hitting that fear drum more often than others, but every news agency knows that if it bleeds, it leads. And if you can constantly keep on hitting that same, button to get people to sit up and look at whatever they're saying, because the thing that is going on is something that can be seen as fearful, and they will get the clicks, and they will get the views, and they will get the advertising dollars.
I think another big emotion that we see is contempt or disgust, kind of like a range in that spectrum that's directed towards other people over like what they say or what they do or how they live or their perceived motivations, So you can think about like the right wing criticizing, and this goes all the way back to the Reagan years, welfare queens, That was like a strategy on their part. Look at those people who are soaking us. You taxpayers, you're paying for these people that don't do a lick of work. You're supposed to be disgusted with them. And I think there's a good bit of that coming from the progressive or left side towards people. I mean, think about like some of the things that candidates have said. For Mitt Romney, way back when he was running against Obama, saying 47% of the people are never going to vote for us because they're lazy and entitled and stuff like that. You had Hillary Clinton calling people a basket of deplorables, and now that made them angry, but it displays contempt, right, or disgust with these people. Obama, I can't remember the exact quote, but he said something about people like holding onto their guns out of their
Bibles and their guns.
Was that what it was? Okay, yeah. But what was what he attributed a motivation to them? It was like out of desperation or something like that. And what it's doing is it's painting a picture of the other people as gross or disgusting, or not really human,
Right. It's the whole otherizing process.
Yeah.
And often, there's an organization called, I think, the Greater Angels.
Oh, I've never heard of them.
There's it's an organization that tries to get really in-depth, long-form conversations with people from really differing political views, at least in the United States.
Interesting.
And it definitely helps dispel the idea that these people are not thinking, that they are like having some sort of I don't know, that they haven't thought through their process. And a lot of them, like the vast majority of them, they think through, they have really strong reasons. It might be based off of, wrong preconceptions. Yeah. But there is a really rational thought process that these people come to these conclusions about. And if you just automatically think that they're not thinking, then you're making a incorrect assertion about how they're going about these things.
Yeah, I would say that has been a big problem on the left or progressive side, tending to just associate being conservative with being stupid. You're voting against your class interests or stuff like that. I think in recent times, conservatives have become just as big offenders on that matter. They'll use terms like, "Oh, this is common sense," like implying that the other side doesn't have any common sense, or that they're stupid. They call them libtards or stuff like that. So, yeah. Any other emotions that you think are particularly salient here, or should we go on to talk about cognitive issues?
I think there's the envy and injustice can be seen kind of both ways from different things, and so this idea, for
that
the
somebody
idea,
else is getting over, right?
Right, and like the flyover states, quote unquote, feeling like the economy has been created in a way that disadvantages them, and to a certain extent, I agree with that assertion. I don't usually agree with the solutions that are often put forward for why this is, but there is a palpable envy of seeing towns lose their populations, and they see them slowly declining, and they have this memory of halcyon days where their town was doing well, and there was all sorts of new people that were living there and on the upswing, and towns and cities, they have their upswings and their downswings, and when people see the thing that they love start to degrade, I could see where that could be a source of anger, and I understand that fear and that envy, thinking that other people are getting it, especially if you're someone comes around and starts to say this out group, this immigrant group, or this demographic group is the reason why this is happening to you. That's an easy scapegoat for
somebody
a much
else
more
is
difficult...
getting what you ought to be having. Yeah. I think there's a lot of that. Anytime a new government program is announced, for example, the loan forgiveness thing. Okay, if you look at student loans, they have, over the course of 4 generations, the boomers had it super, super easy. My mom didn't pay back her student loans, and it took them 15 years to track her down, and they wrote her a really nice letter saying, we noticed you never paid back your student loans. We'd love if you could think about an installment plan. No rush, we won't charge you any interest. It's like the opposite today. You die, your student loans are part of your estate. You go bankrupt, you're not free of your loans even then. And so, they came along and they're like, yeah, maybe we'll forgive some of the student loans. And what were people doing immediately? They're like, well, I paid back my loans. Why the hell should these people get off? And you're like, come on, is it hurting you to actually have somebody else get something that will help them out, allow them to buy a house maybe 10 years down the line, or, be able to afford other things that, are good for the economy? Right. And there's so many people out there that are just so concerned with them not having what somebody else is perceived to be getting that, I think there is a real politics of envy, and I'd say it's on both left and right, and probably a lot of people in the center too.
I was an office manager of a company during COVID and had to do the PPP loan application. Yeah, and so every business in the country got tens to hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars in totally forgiven loans. Yep. To deal with that, and it's it's. And, you go back, what was it, the Great Recession, and how the government bailed out banks. And, the government, every once in a while, decides that it is in the benefit of the country or the populace to do these things. Yeah. And, I don't know, but every time that there's people that are going to be winners and losers when these decisions are made, and people are going to be angry.
Well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, a lot of the people perceive themselves as losers, but they're not really losing anything. They're losing something. And so this is kind of a good lead into cognitive mistakes, right? Because somebody's telling them that they're losing out. They're generally not coming to these ideas all by themselves, just sitting in a room meditating or something, a la René Descartes. They're getting this from somebody who's saying, hey, you're being screwed, man. You should be upset, So let's talk about cognitive issues. I mean, I think there's things that if you consume a lot of political news and you allow it to get to you, it's going to produce some we could call them cognitive biases or cognitive problems, that is, errors in thinking. So what do you think are some of the most important ones?
Like, what do you mean? Humans have errors in thinking? Never. We're perfectly rational
That would
creatures.
be an error in thinking right there.
Yes, it would. So there's so many of them. I guess one of them that you see all the time is this. We assume that other people think like us, and will respond to the same arguments that convinced us of a thing, and like this is kind of like that when you're talking about common sense.
Yeah.
And common sense isn't common, and common sense isn't the same thing between two different groups of people. Because common sense is kind of like a cultural cachet of rules of thumb that are built into a locality or group. And some common senses will help you benefit in certain locations and times that it will be totally to your detriment in other places in time.
Yeah.
And so this whole idea of, okay, well, if I do this, then you'll do that. So, for example, like there's the old meme of like the boomer saying, "Oh, just go out and pound the pavement and give out some applications to people," because like that's how it worked for them. That was a great like common sense thing at the time.
Yep.
Great for them. It worked once. It doesn't work anymore. And so. As well as the hiring doesn't work the same, like the hiring managers aren't thinking the same way, and so your rules of thumb don't work anymore. And so this idea that everyone else thinks like you are, or you have the same base ground of information, is a massive cognitive bias.
There's two things I would say to follow up on that. One is because of television, there's a lot of processes that used to work a certain way, and then they got made part of shows, right? And people who don't understand how these processes work think things are like they were in 1960 because they keep on getting passed on. And so, there's that whole effect. And then there's the fact that things are different everywhere, Policing isn't the same in Milwaukee as it is in New York, as it is in New Orleans. So you can't watch Law and Order and then be like, yeah, I understand how policing works. I understand procedure. No, it's, that's not even a faithful representation of New York policing. And hell, the shows are, some of the episodes are like 25 years old. So they're probably out of date, So there's all of that going on as well in the mix. But I think a lot of people, that's what's stuck in their head,
Yes. Another thing is like we're assuming our information sources are reliable.
Yeah.
And they're not. We're not allowing ourselves to be manipulated, and so like
big assumption there,
yeah. Every news source is biased. There's no unbiased news source. Period. Some are less biased than others, but you're never going to get one single news source that's going to give you like the unvarnished, unfiltered truth. Even if you're given only true statements, the order that you are presenting with news, as well as what people choose to include and disclude for time, are also going to be things that are going to create some sort of bias in that information.
Yeah. I think another big one, in the show notes, we have correlation versus causation. And we could do like a whole show on that because it's a really important topic that I think a lot of people just don't get. So, correlation is two things coincide, an awful lot. Causation
Shark attacks and ice cream go up at the same time every year.
Yeah, because it's summer, right?
Right. No, it's because ice cream causes sharks, don't you know?
Oh, that's causation, right?
Of course.
And a lot of the things that people get really worked up about, the causality is incredibly complex. So, for example, who's responsible for inflation? I mean, this is going to be an oversimplification, but if we had to pick anybody, it's not a politician. It is food companies who decided to use the fact that some inflation was going on to jack up their prices, and they heated up inflation a bit more. But even that's an incomplete picture, right? So
it's a massive internet, it's a world economy. Yeah. You can't put it to any one politician. There's 1,000 different inputs to this output.
Even if we take something just simpler, right? So food is like a million different items. Gas, gasoline, gas prices will go up, and then people will be saying, you know what? We should release the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That'll bring gas prices down. And would it? Well, it depends. It depends on a million different things, and it might do nothing. It might actually raise the prices. It's not so simple as a politician has a lever that they can, they're not doing what they ought to be doing. And so people get really worked up about this kind of stuff. Or,
just the economy in general. It takes at least a year for new policies to start to affect the economy. And then there's so many things that are outside of the governmental inputs to the economy that you can maybe 20% of this is these person's particular policies and 80% is something else. Maybe there was a massive typhoon in Japan and some of these big inputs, or hit Taiwan specifically, because that's where the vast majority of all the high-end computer chips come from. Things like these happen all the time, and heck, right now there's a war going on in Ukraine, and that also has massively upended international markets for a number of things.
And grain. It actually affected one of the companies that I have a course, it's called Listenable, and it's a Ukrainian company. The Ukrainians were doing all this high-tech stuff, and so I produced a course on Stoic philosophy. They're not taking any new courses, and they're not promoting stuff. Why? Because there's a war going on. They got other stuff to focus on, and I could be those damn Ukrainians, they're letting me down. Well, no, they're fighting off Russians, So, there's a million things like this that we could talk about, the correlation versus causation thing. And I think that, a steady diet of internet news and social media probably makes you less able to resist that, because there's people who are constantly pushing these causation narratives, let's call them. This is the person who's responsible, blame them, write a letter, vote against them, that sort of stuff.
I thought the little stickers, the I did that stickers were hilarious. If you don't know, there's a little picture of Joe Biden with his finger out and point to the gas price, and then sometimes the gas prices will go really low. I was oh well, apparently this is supposed to be good now. But
the whole thanks Obama meme, right, was that as well. Your relationship breaks up. Thanks Obama.
Right. I think there's probably another corollary for George W. Bush.
Yep.
But I think confirmation bias is definitely a big one that everyone has to a certain extent. Anytime that you go onto the internet to look for some article and or study that is going to prove your point in an argument is exactly that. It is, you are looking for something to confirm the biases that you came with. You are not coming from this as a kind of maybe a scientific endeavor where you're I have no preconceptions. I'm going to investigate this area and then come to conclusions from the data. You have a preconceived, you have an answer, and you need to just find that reference. And there's so many studies and that you can almost always find something that's going to support your particular idea. And if that's where you stop once you find one, then you are doing that wrong. And oftentimes it's a really long process to actually fully understand a process. And that's kind of why we have experts, because there are people that spend their entire times, talking about a specific, fish species in the upper Bighorn River system in Montana, and that's their specialty. They've read all the papers, they've gone out and done the research. And if you're gonna spout off and they're there and they're well, there's actually 36 other studies that go against you on the speckled trout over here.
Yeah, there's that whole you're Googling and watching YouTube does not match up to somebody's expertise. I mean, it's interesting. We live in this time of people saying that they do their own research. It's not really research. Research is something rigorous that you do, and then ask other people, hey, am I doing this right? Am I doing this wrong? So, but we should, before we go too far into this, we should talk about some of the things we can do. So, now we've talked about how bad things are. What can we actually do to feel better, to not be so crippled or riled up or whatever it is that we're upset over?
Pull out your cable cord and your internet services. Life will be much better.
I mean, do you think that would is like retreating? Some people say, I don't look at anything political. I just watch videos of kittens, or I don't even watch things on the internet. Sort of like how, way back in the day, there were some people that I even knew a few of these people, and they would brag about, I don't watch TV. It's just a wasteland. It's stupid. And you could talk to them about good shows and they wouldn't know what you're talking about because they were really consistent about it. I don't know that that's a very workable approach for a lot of us. And it might actually be, since we do have to vote, or at least we have the opportunity to vote, maybe it's a bad idea to just withdraw completely.
I agree. That was obviously a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it is a thing that people will say, but I don't think it is optimal to actually living in a society, or at least our society.
Do you think that it could be okay to take a break for a week and say, I'm just not going to follow politics for a week? Okay.
Absolutely. I think having a digital detox every once in a while is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Go find a couple books that you like, and that will be your entertainment for the week. Turn off your phone as much as possible.
Stay in your apartment, order in. Don't talk politics with the person who brings the food.
I've got a friend who's got a cabin up north in Door County, and I've gone up there for an extended weekend, maybe 5 days, and just tried to turn off everything. That was enjoyable. Yeah,
that could be quite good. And we used to do stuff like that pretty routinely because if you went out of range, you couldn't watch TV. You wouldn't get your paper,
Right. I guess I used to, way back in the day, I was a camp counselor, and, you didn't have really good data. You didn't get data up there, and this was kind of early smartphone era.
Okay.
And so you were kind of cut off, and you'd get out to go your one day a week that you had off for dinner, and you'd go into town, and you'd start hearing what was going on. It's oh, okay, well, that happened. Back to the camp we go.
Yeah. So, one of the things that we were going to talk about, so not going so extreme as I'm going up to the cabin in the woods and, going to tune out, but you can reduce and restrict your political media consumption. And I think that's a prudent thing to do. You don't need to be, if you're checking it, 10 times a day, that's probably too much. Even 3 times a day might be too much because, not all that much is going to have changed. How do you think we ought to do this?
Here's one, the no news before noon is a process I've used because I'll often get up in the morning and throw on the radio or something, and it starts off with the news, and that kind of gets me into this process of thinking about that, and it kind of goads me into keep checking it later in the day. But if I just say hey, I don't need the news in the morning, it's fine. Nothing's gonna blow up too much while I'm away. I'm no linchpin to this thing, and I can make sure that I get the things I need to get done, and it gets me into the working process of the day, and it then I get sidetracked by the things I actually want to do. But I often find that because there's a nice little dopamine release of reading the news and oh, I know this new thing, and that fearful thing that is now partially relieved because there's all this new information from the news, and so now I can make better decisions, kind of goes away a little bit, and it helps me reorient well. And this is something I've used to great effect in the past.
I like that idea. I mean, it doesn't have to be noon. You could set any arbitrary time. But, I'm reminded of a guy who I worked for a very short 3 weeks, a tree cutting service when I was in college. And he was just like an outright, hardcore bigot, constantly using racial slurs. He was very misogynist. And his morning routine was get up, make coffee, turn on Fox News. And like the whole time that he was driving around, he's listening to AM, radio shows like Rush Limbaugh and stuff like that. And then he'd get out and he's all pissed off and start spouting stuff. And, he was always surprised that the rest of us working for him didn't share his political views or didn't care. We had a guy who was a Vietnam vet, and he's like, "Hey man, I've seen some real stuff. The stuff you're complaining about isn't anything." So yeah,
that kind of feeling is like reminiscent of the 10-minute hate.
Oh right, yeah,
1984. It's like. Yeah, like, everyone get out and like we're gonna get angry at the
Oceania.
Right? No,
yeah.
they were Oceania, and so I think Eurasia.
We've always been at war with Eurasia. Is that what the line was? Yeah.
Yeah. So like everyone would go out and they'd hate on Eurasia for a bit, and that was cathartic and got everyone in the same mood but also riled up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So another thing that I think we can do that kind of aligns with this, and it's a little bit, so what we talked about just now was kind of privative or negative. Don't do this. Something more positive, the world is not all politics. Your life should be full of all sorts of other things. So find and maintain relationships that don't have anything to do with politics. And, it doesn't mean that nobody can ever talk politics, but it should be less about that. And, it could be like you're into role-playing games. Find the local place where people gather to do role-playing games or tabletop games. You're into, the Brewers? Well, go to the games or hang out at a bar where people are watching it. And don't worry too much about politics, or you can take up knitting or any other thing, gardening, right? It doesn't always have to be making political points all the time. And if you hang out with, there are weirdos in other ways, right? You could have people that are too much into knitting or too much into role-playing games or whatever. But that might be less of a problem these days than being too much into politics. So, seeking people out, seeking out venues, seeking out communities where you can actually develop, enjoy, live out relationships that don't have anything to do with the political life, that might be very helpful.
Yeah, there's an extra level of like intimacy when you're physically with people.
Yeah, true.
And like living online, it gets us really isolated, and then we just hear certain voices, and they are repeated over and over. And if you don't have, as the kids say, don't go out and touch grass, then you're not going to create like those more deep relationships with people. And we're a social species, and we're not meant to live in little caves of our own designs, totally away from other humans.
Yeah, just looking at screens all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Interacting just with our online people.
Right.
Now, of course, I have to fess up. I have clientele all over the globe, and some of my best friends are way out of the country, and I've never actually been in the same room as some of them. But,
right. Hell, like we see each other online way more than we see ourselves in person.
And we live in the same town,
Right.
So, that's true, yeah. COVID did kind of put a wrench into that, right? This is a digression, but our first two shows were pre-COVID. Actually, our second show was just as the lockdown was happening, and we arrived. We didn't get the email that the station was closed, and so we got to do that one. And then after that, we just went online, and we found this MO that works pretty good, and so we don't have to actually be in the same place at the same time. But it's nice to meet up every once in a while,
Yeah, like we need to go for another walk.
Yeah.
So also we need to be aware of economic incentives for news. We talked about this a little bit, but that if it bleeds, it leads. And that there is an economic incentive in turning news into entertainment. This is like a lot of the constantly online cable news networks will say that they're not actually news most of the time, that it's opinion entertainment.
Fox actually did that with, I think it was the Tucker Carlson show, to evade a lawsuit. Right?
Yeah.
They said,
if it was news, then it would be held to a higher standard.
Yep.
If it's just entertainment, it's not. And so, they know that if they rile up people, that it oftentimes you have assertions that are not based in fact, and that's perfectly fine because it gets them the views, but it's not news. And so, be aware of what things are actually news. And what things are, opinion and news entertainment. And these things are far away from being the same thing.
Yeah, that's a good one. And that, realizing that they're not telling you all of these things because they have your best interests at heart. They're telling you them because you are, there's that famous saying with online platforms, if it's free, you are the product. Is that how it goes?
Yeah, if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product.
That's right, yeah. And that's the way it is for a lot of this online news stuff,
or just like cable news. Even if you're paying for cable, they're still selling you the ads there.
That's true, yeah. Now, we have one that a remedy that comes directly from philosophy, and Epictetus makes this great distinction that other people, including Aristotle and the other Stoics like Epictetus, said, what's in your control or what's in your power, what's up to you, and what isn't. There's so many things where you could say that the news is calls to action, calls to either do something or say something or to feel something. And is that, how you should respond? A lot of this isn't another way of translating the term, the epimin, that means up to us, is our business. A lot of the stuff that we're getting news about, it's not really our business. We don't have to take a stand on it. I mean, I probably should care about getting lead pipes out of the Milwaukee, housing places, because that's bad for kids in general, and it's bad for our society. As we've taken out lead paint and lead pipes, we've seen crime rates go down significantly, and that's a correlation. That's not a causation, but there is some connection there, right?
There is some causation. It's just not all the causation.
Yeah, exactly. It's complex and all of that. So I should care about that, but do I have to be wear a t-shirt that has I'll hit you with a lead pipe if you don't get the lead pipes out of our drinking water or stuff like that? No, I mean, and if somebody proposed that, you should probably say, hey, not my business, you want to wear that shirt, you go ahead and do that. There's so many things where I think, so we don't have to have opinions on everything. Actually, the smartest thing I ever saw an actor say was Rob Lowe, in our invasion of Iraq, right? There was this show at the time called The West Wing, and I don't remember who he played, but he was kind of some high official in the fictional Democrat administration, right? And so some reporters asked him, hey, what do you think about invading Iraq? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? And it was so smart. He said, listen, I'm an actor. I play a guy on TV who's smart enough to answer that question. I'm not smart enough to answer that question. I don't know. I don't know if we should be invading Iraq. And the fact that you're asking me this, it's sort of like, we used to have these commercials where there would be a guy and he would actually say, I'm not a doctor, but I play a doctor on TV. And then he'd recommend hemorrhoid ointment or aspirin or whatever it was that he was recommending. And he's telling you, I'm not a doctor. I play one on TV. And it still worked. People would buy the product, right? There's a lot of things where we just do not need to have opinions on it. You know, we don't have to dig into everything. We don't always have to convince everybody to our side. The world is not going to end if our neighbor, has a political sign of a candidate that we don't like. That's all stuff that's out of our control. And if we realize that, then we can free ourselves, at least to some degree.
Yeah, and if you do want to do something about lead pipes, great, good for you. Do it well. Don't be, a dick about it.
Yeah.
Go and do the work and campaign for it. That's great. Do that. But try to do it with excellence as much as you can.
Yeah, there you go. That is in our control, right?
Yes. So we also have to recognize to avoid emotional contagion. Think of every time that you've gone to a sporting event, and especially if you're like not really associated with either of the teams, and like I was just at the Ren Fair yesterday, and so there's people doing a jousting event, and so like I happen to sit in a section, and one of the jousters is like riling up that sort of section of the crowd, and there's another one on the other, and I don't know this guy from Adam, but like we're all cheering for him just because there's no actual reason, and so it's like, okay, why are we doing this? Like, it's like it's fun, we know it's kind of at least partially pretend and whatnot, but like that's just a crowd, and we're all getting riled up for what reason?
Yeah. Now, the term is kind of a recent one. Psychologists use this, but it goes all the way back to philosophers. Like Adam Smith, in his theory of the moral sentiments, talks about this phenomenon. The great phenomenologist Max Shaler in The Nature of Sympathy has like a whole section on emotional contagion and how it's not a good thing, because we're kind of out of control when this happens, right? But even Aristotle and Seneca talk about this way, way back in ancient Greece and Rome. It's a very common phenomenon, and it can be produced directly by observing other people. So like you mentioned, being in the box with all these people that are, go Black Knight, kick his ass or something like that, right? But it can also be imaginary. It could be online stuff, you see somebody, you see a video of somebody getting upset and now you're upset as well. That's not a good thing for you. A lot of these they are your emotions, but they're being produced just as a mimicry response to somebody else. And it could be anger, it could be fear, it could be depression, it could be disgust. There can be good ones like, excitement, wonder, joy. But most of the time, I think in politics, those aren't the emotions that are being conveyed,
No. And for more, you can look up our episode on emotions and football.
Did we do an episode on emotions and football?
Oh, absolutely. It's all about like being a fan of a team and how that can lead to really negative outcomes.
Was that the one where we interviewed the former NFL player?
We did a different one, but yeah, okay. that was so good. There's a former Colts lineman, I want to say.
Chiefs and Jets. But we should bring him on again because now he's actually teaching philosophy classes.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear it. All right. Do you want to talk about Aristotle?
Yeah, so Aristotle has an insight that I think, he's got a couple insights, but we'll probably only get to one or two of them that are important. So in his Politics, which is based on him and his research assistants doing a survey of all of the different political communities in ancient Greece, over 200 of them. He analyzed all their constitutions. His buddy Theophrastus did studies of all their laws. Aristotle actually says in the Politics, not a single one of these city-states is actually well run. They're all deficient. Some are worse, some are better, but none of them are good. And, I think as Americans, we're often disabled by what we call American exceptionalism, which is the idea that, like, it's better here than it is anywhere else. We're something special, that, city on a hill ideology that came from the early Puritans who talked about that. Now, they meant if you're a city on a hill, you have a special responsibility. But we take it as everything's great until these bad guys came along and screwed up our politics. No, it's always been a mess. things have never been great, It's always been contentious. We've always had problems. Sometimes we're more able to work them out. We seem to be pretty unable to do that in terms of our contemporary politics because of the polarization. But, it's been like that before. I mean, we fought a civil war. Things were pretty bad back then, too. So I think if we keep this in mind, that, we're not aiming at the perfect, and we're not deviating from some legendary ideal. It was wonderful back then. We're always in the middle of crap. I think taking that perspective, it may sound kind of cynical. I think that can be very healthy. I mean, what do you think, Dan?
Yeah, like to think that we're perfect and that nothing like that, everything is going to this is kind of like a defeatism or a doom loop to like thing that we're just like in a constant decline from what used to be, is like very short-sighted. And you can see, like, if you look at other civilizations, there might be things that don't work with us and our culture and whatnot, but there might be some things that do work quite well. And to think that we can't, crib some notes from other cultures and civilizations, then I think that's like a really narrow-minded way of looking at these things.
Yeah, this is going to be a bit of a digression, but there's so many things in other people's political systems that seem to be functioning better than ours. Like, it would be nice to not just have two main parties that divide everything between them. And even if we had, what do they call it, ranked choice voting, where like the third parties, they can kick their votes over to somebody else.
Ranked choice or instant runoff voting.
Yeah.
Is objectively superior to the first past the post system that we're currently running.
Yeah.
And if you had that, then you could actually have viable third parties, because when you have a first past the post voting, then you will always end up with two parties, and
third parties come to be viewed as just spoilers, and so you don't want a third party that's strong on your side. So if you're a Democrat, you don't want the Greens getting too much. If you're a Republican, you don't want the Libertarians or Constitution Party getting too much. It's interesting because they're trying to get Robert Kennedy Jr. off the ballot in a lot of places because they're worried he's going to take Trump votes away from Trump in some of these key states, because now he's throwing himself in with Trump, right? So, that's there's other things too, where we could be like, well, why do we have to have this fragmented patchwork of educational things or healthcare, right? Why does it have to be different from every single state? Why can't we have a national healthcare system like most civilized countries do? That would be kind of nice. And a lot of people are like, oh no, that would be terrible. You can't see your doctor, whatever nonsense. The insurance companies, won't anyone think of the insurance companies?
Right. I do want to bring up one last thing before we get to the end, which is that just like governments aren't going to be perfect, so do all parties are going to be imperfect things. No individual party or philosophy is going to work for everyone and everywhere at all times. That these things have to be constantly updated and brought with some new lifeblood and water.
That's a good point. Should we? We're getting really close to the end. Do you want to lead us out?
So yes, we're going to leave you today with the words of H.L. Mencken. The whole aim of political parties is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary.